Hello and welcome to the Modern Adventurer podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe to the show and hit that like button because we have some incredible stories to tell on this channel. Coming up.
The journey that they took was that they were forced to take this journey because of the Western expansion across America. And they were forced to relocate from their homes in the Great Smoky Mountains, which is where the Cherokee were traditionally based. And they were forced to walk, I think it was 1,200 miles into Oklahoma, which was classed as Indian territory at that point. And now it's modern day Oklahoma. So they were forced with four other tribes that were on the eastern side of the US. They were all forced at that point to walk all that distance in midwinter and to end up in Oklahoma. And this story, because of the tragedy of the story for the Cherokee people, because so many of them died on this route, was called the Trail of Tears.
On today's show, we have Ian Finch, an adventure photographer and explorer who has covered a wide range of expeditions over the years. From canoeing up in the wilderness of Scotland to following the trails of the Cherokee people, he has some incredible stories to tell. And on today's podcast, we are going into detail about one or two of these stories. So I am delighted to introduce Ian Finch to the show.
Hey, how you doing?
Very well. Well, for people listening, Ian and I had the pleasure of meeting about 3 weeks ago for a photo shoot with Musto. And Ian has some pretty incredible adventure stories to tell, and I was delighted to get him on. But before we sort of jump into it, Ian, I suppose probably the best place to start is with you and about yourself.
Yeah, so first and foremost, I'm a photographer, so adventure photographer, and I work with outdoor brands to help them sort of like create like really strong visual narratives for up and coming shoots. And also, I am an expedition leader, so I've conducted sort of some pretty sort of big, meaningful expeditions in some like wild places all over the globe. And then I come back and I'm really passionate about telling those stories and helping inspire people to sort of find their own adventure and undertake their own big journeys.
So what do you think caused you to go into this sort of field? Because I know you were a former Royal Marines. Do you think that training and that background sort of set you on this path?
I think the military aspect of my life, you know, looking back on it, the things that I took from that now are more the mindset principles of that you need and you utilize when you're on expeditions, about like dealing with cold weather, routines, like positive habits, dealing with challenge and setbacks and failure, or having to, you know, push forward physically in sort of arduous times. Those are the things I look back and think that's what I took from my career in the Marines. All the practical stuff, yeah, you do take certain aspects of that and bring that forward, but those real practical skills fade. The mental ones and the sort of the ones that you really absorb into your character, the ones that you take forward without a doubt.
How long were you in the Royal Marines for?
So it was close to about 5 years in the end. So I left in 2008, which is quite a long time ago now.
And so you've been on a sort of quest for big grand adventures ever since.
Yeah. It was when I left the Corps, and even before that, I was always wild camping, going to Scotland and Wales, Lake District, and wild camping all over the place with friends and that kind of stuff. But when I came out of the Marines, that continued because I've always had this like deep love of nature and wildness and wildlife and all of those kind of things. So it didn't, the expedition stuff didn't really take hold until I did sort of mounting leader training. And then I was doing sort of slightly longer journeys, and then I would go to the Hebrides, and I walked the length of the Outer Hebrides, which was my first long distance kind of walk as such. And then I found I really wanted, when the photography and that really became a big part of my life, I started to really think about narrative and the journeys that I was taking on. I wanted them to be bigger and longer and have a much stronger narrative where I could really immerse myself in a story, or a story in a group of people, or a landscape, or an environmental story. And as I really sort of cultivated the desire to photograph and write about the journeys that I was on, I was then looking for bigger, more stronger stories, which then led to the bigger journeys. So yeah, it was quite an organic process to lead into the real big expeditions. But it's now I couldn't imagine my life without them, to be honest.
Well, let's jump into them. So one of your journeys was in the Yukon, the Cherokee Trail. What was that about? What was the sort of aims of that trip?
So it was actually the idea of my expedition partner, Jamie Barnes. And previously to that, a few years before that, I had descended the Yukon River by canoe, where the narrative of that story was to meet and some of the many native groups that lived along that river. So a lot of my expeditions revolve around learning and meeting native groups in a certain region that we're in, and then learning about traditions and heritage and stuff like that, and environmental aspects of their life, their modern life. So the Cherokee journey was based around a route that the Cherokee people were forced to take in 1838, and the sort of in brief, the journey that they took was that they were forced to take this journey because of the Western expansion across America, and they were forced to relocate from their homes in the Great Smoky Mountains, which is where the Cherokee were traditionally based, and they were forced to walk, I think it was 1,200 miles into Oklahoma, which was classed as Indian territory at that point. And now it's modern day Oklahoma. So they were forced with four other tribes that were on the eastern side of the US. They were all forced at that point to walk all that distance in midwinter, and to end up in Oklahoma. And this story, because of the tragedy of the story for the Cherokee people, because so many of them died on this route, was called the Trail of Tears, or as the Cherokee call it, the trail where they cried. And this is because, lots of people died on that trail. It's a very sacred trail to the Cherokee, even to this day. And we thought it would be very interesting to rewalk this trail and follow, because there was many aspects to this trail. So some Cherokee was split up into many detachments. So the American army at this point split up and moved certain aspects of the Cherokee by river, by land, and all this kind of thing. So we incorporated many different aspects of many different routes of the same Trail of Tears. So that took us about 3 months, where we crossed a mountain range, we paddled, so we canoed 900 miles, and then we walked another 400 miles at the end of the trip. And we ended up in Oklahoma at the Cherokee Heritage Center, which is where all Cherokee artifacts are kept, all the Cherokee baskets, lots of beautiful Cherokee tradition is kept in this museum. So we actually finished the trail, and we actually finished the trail walking with Cherokee people. So this was all pre-organized, and we first made connections with the Cherokee by the Cherokee Nation, which is the kind of government body for the Cherokee Nation itself. And we asked permission to do the trail, because obviously it's a very sacred trail, and there's obviously some sensitivity towards two white guys from Europe doing the trail. So we asked permission, and then we were granted that. And it was our sort of aim to tell a really authentic representation of the trail as we went. So it was actually quite difficult to do that because there was massive periods where we weren't we were going from one section to another to another. So what we decided to do was complete the whole journey and then spend a week with the Cherokee, or a number of Cherokee people, and live with them in Oklahoma. And then we really learn about the story, visit some historical sites, look at all manner of Cherokee culture, modern and sort of traditional. And that featured when we wrote that photograph, that featured in Sidetrack magazine as one of their biggest stories, a 20-page story.
Wow. How did the Cherokee people sort of take to this story?
Um, a lot of when we arrived into Oklahoma, and we were telling people that we were doing this, because a lot of the time we weren't saying anything per se. So we would, if we were stopping off along the way and speaking to random people or staying with random people, we would tell them this story and why we're doing it. But we kind of kept it quite simple. So once we got into Oklahoma, a lot of the questions that came up were why are two white guys doing this? And understandably, that question was quite important for us to ask. So we both very much interested in Native American tradition and heritage, and I've come from a background where my dad was very much interested in that and still is interested in that. So I've kind of absorbed that from him. So we just told them that we felt it's a story that people in the UK haven't heard. It's a story that still needs to be heard. And we felt it's just really important that stories like this are remembered and continue to be remembered. So it went down with the Cherokee people. It went down well. And a lot of the time people were saying thank you as well for making this story visible in different cultures. Amazing.
And was it all plain sailing? Because you're doing this in the sort of midwinter, you said.
No, so the original trail was in midwinter. So when the Cherokee were forced to walk this route, it was in 1838, the winter of that year. We did it in summer.
Okay.
Well, not in summer, but we started in the Great Smoky Mountains in March. And that was going down to -6, -8 in the mountains for that first week. So that was pretty cold. But then it went from April into May. But we also paddled the 900 miles of canoeing, which was on the Tennessee River, the Ohio, and the Mississippi, was actually through kind of tornado season. So it was pretty treacherous to be canoeing. And also, prior to that period on the water, they had the worst weather in 20 years in terms of rainfall, in not only in the regions where the main part of the river was, but at the source as well. So all of the rivers were flooded, and all of the rivers had reached into the forests that were on the banks. So a lot of the time we were actually paddling through forests. We were paddling through whirlpools, all sorts of crazy stuff, because the hydrology of the river had changed, because it was pushed into the forests and everything like that. And the water was going through submerged trunks, even submerged buildings at that point. And also, it's on a couple of the sections, because of the really extreme weather and the flooding of the rivers, we were paddling past trees that were upside down houses that were upside down in trees and all of that kind of stuff, which was just incredible, really. So the conditions per se weren't too bad, but the actual, in terms of like the climate conditions, but the actual on the ground, the conditions were, and on the rivers, they were quite treacherous and incredibly dangerous. And there was one time that we actually nearly died. Actually, probably two occasions that we nearly died on the river.
What happened?
So we had paddled the whole of the Tennessee River, which was a couple of hundred miles, maybe 500-600 miles. Then the Tennessee goes up to the Ohio, and then the Ohio meets the Mississippi. So the Mississippi is still used as a superhighway. So the Mississippi apparently it's cheaper to still move cargo and goods up the Mississippi like the old days on these huge barges. Now, these barges are these high-powered kind of steamer boats that then push these huge metal containers, which are 100 feet long, 200 feet long. But one of these boats can push upwards of 24 containers, so all stacked in a line in front of each other. So when we got onto the Mississippi, we then, not only did we have the added danger of the river being flooded, et cetera, we also had the added danger of these huge boats coming up the river and kicking off these huge wakes, which were sometimes 6-8 feet high, the wakes that were on the river. So whenever we saw them, we had to go pull into one of the forests, which was still flooded, and tie the boat up, wait for the barge to go past, take on the swell, holding onto the trees and stuff like that, and then paddle back out, paddle down river. And if we saw another one, it'd be exactly the same story. And this could happen 10, 20 times a day sometimes. So when the barges aren't pushing these metal containers, the containers are kept on the sides of the river. So maybe sometimes two abreast, and then lined up down the river and tied by these metal chains, maybe 10 feet from the shore. And then when the barges need them, they go to these containers, pick them up, and then move them on and fill them with grain and coal and cement, etc. So we found that it was actually slightly more safer to, instead of paddling out in the river where the barges were, was actually to paddle down between the containers. So you had the bank on one side, and then there was a 10-foot gap, and then one of these metal containers. So we would paddle down the side of these containers in these narrow channels. Then every 15 to 20 feet, or every 100 feet maybe, there would be a 100-meter gap between sets of containers, and then there'll be another 3 or 4 containers, and then another 100-meter gap. And in quite a few of these gaps between the containers, there was an eddy. So an eddy, just for people that know, is an area of water that's almost coming back on itself. So the water reverses because of where it's situated on the river and the flow, and et cetera, et cetera. So we would stop in these eddies between the containers and actually have a rest. So one of these days, the weather was really bad. So we had maybe like 20-mile-an-hour winds on the river, which is quite bad, kicking up a massive swell. And we had about 3 miles to go to get to this town where we knew we had pizza, coffee, shelter. So we had the canoe on the sides of the river, and we made a decision to take on the river with the current, which was at 7 knots, which is pretty fast for a river, with wind, with a very bad storm that was coming in, just to get to this town. Now, these are the kind of decisions that you make, which sometimes you don't realize at the time can be actually life and death. And you take them because, you think you want shelter, pizza, warm bed, when really maybe we should have stayed in a tent on the side of that kind of muddy, horrible river for safety. But anyway, we decided to go for it, and we were nipping down between the sides of these containers, and there was a huge storm that was coming in to our side there. And there's pictures of this on my Instagram, which is almost like a forming tornado. And we knew we had to get to this town for safety. And it was raining. It was seriously torrential rain. And we pulled into one of these, what we thought was an eddy between these 2 massive containers. And we were reaching down into the canoe to get the cameras out to take a picture of this storm. And then as I looked up, I realized that we were still in the flow of the river. Now, at this point, the Mississippi was meeting. It was a convergence point of the Mississippi and the Ohio, and it was on the bend. So for those that know about water and rivers and canoeing or whatever, the bend is the fastest part of the river, because the water's pushed into the bend and then pushed out of the bend. And there was just a kind of a convergence of all manner of problems at that point. So you had the flow, the storm, the narrow distance between the 2 containers. So as I looked up, the canoe was moving forward, nose in, to one of these containers. Now, these containers have their fronts are like that. So the water was going down and underneath these containers at a rapid speed. So I just screamed to Jamie to start paddling. And as he started paddling, I kind of turned the canoe sideways, so we were side on to the container. And then we were paddling hard. So as we were paddling, we were going forwards and sideways with the flow. And we just missed the front of this container, was having this water sucked underneath it. But then as we came round the side of this container, there was a barge coming straight for us. And at this point, it was, I can only remember the feeling of, it was like a hose pipe. And when you squeeze the hose pipe and the water being shot out of the front of a hose pipe so fast when you squeeze it, like a garden hose pipe. And we just shot between the barge and the container like a bullet, because the water was so fast and we were getting channeled past it. And then the swell of the barge hit us, but I turned the canoe into the swell, and then we went over the swell. And then 10 minutes later, we paddled into this tiny, tiny coastal, not even coastal, it was a tiny town called Whitcliffe in Kentucky. And the rain was so heavy, and we were just sitting there, and the canoe was filling up with water, and we were just shaking because of what actually happened. So we managed to just pull ourselves together. We went into this place and said, look, we need somewhere to just chill for the night and stuff like that. But when we got into this tiny port, which was a barge port, so barges were coming in and out there all the time. Apparently, all the barge captains had been on radio saying there's these crazy guys in a canoe out in the storm, out on the river, and to watch out for them because people had been killed at this area before because of all of the convergence of factors. And then a boat captain came in and he said, "You guys are suicidal. Firstly, being on the river when it's flooded like this. Secondly, paddling down by these containers and paddling out on the river at this point." And they were saying that they had seen big boats get sucked under the front of these containers and get basically crushed like a Coke can in a Coke machine. You get those machines where they crush Coke cans. They had seen big boats being pulled in under these and being crushed like that. So we were probably 3 feet away from drowning at any one point. And then strangely enough, something not similar, but something moderately similar happened the following day where we were caught out again, even though we were taking care. So looking back on that situation, it was just you learn a lot of lessons from days like that to trust your instinct, to sometimes try not to be too brave when the weather and the conditions aren't suitable. And also, sometimes it's better to sit and wait it out rather than go for the pizza and go for the warm bed. That's basically.
It's so tempting.
Yeah.
It's so tempting after a few days while camping. But yeah, I mean, and you went even after the captain sort of said you guys are suicidal. You went the next day.
Yeah, so the following morning, the weather was beautiful, and the conditions, the weather was clear. There was no wind on the river, and we sat up for hours, and we were like, "How the hell are we going to get out of this port?" Because there was ships moving in and out of it, and containers moving in and out of it, and we just decided to make a run for it when we saw a gap after that. But then that day was then our biggest canoe day. Our distance day, we canoed 55 miles that day, I think, or 53. So yeah, it's you take the rough with the smooth, and I think it's all about, especially when you're on the river, it's all about mitigating risk, and looking back on it, it's just all about safety. Your life is the most important thing in the world, and coming home safely is the most important thing in the world.
Good. And so I suppose even after those sort of torrid times, what sort of motivated you to sort of keep going? Was it the story, to be able to tell this story?
Not the story of us, in that situation, but what we always had to remember is in times of hardship on that river and when we were walking and crossing the mountains in cold weather, was that the story of the Cherokee was the driving force for that whole journey. And the people during that time lost their homes, lost their livelihoods. They were driven from their spiritual and traditional homes. They were forced into reservations and lands that they had never been to, with at times only the belongings that they had on them. So literally only the clothing that they had on them. So every times got hard, we would think back to that and think, we're here to tell a story. And yes, we've been through a couple of challenging situations, but it's nothing compared to what they went through and still go through from a spiritual perspective and cultural perspective. So that was always in the back of our minds. And when things got bad, yes, we had to check in and be like, okay, we need to look after ourselves, obviously, here and make the right decisions. But we would think back to what those people endured and still endure. And that was our driving force to keep going.
It is quite the story.
Yeah, one of many.
So with the canoeing, you sort of specialize quite a lot in your canoeing expeditions. You also had quite a memorable one in the Yukon. What was the sort of inspiration behind that trip?
So that trip was, again, to learn, meet, talk with the people of the river. And that was kind of my initial sort of ethos. I wanted a 3-month expedition. I wanted a canoe expedition. I wanted to be able to photograph, film, learn, discuss, sit with native people of that region to learn about where their culture stands today, whether there's still a connection to the landscape and the wildlife. Importantly, their connection to the river and whether they sustain livelihoods and food from the river. Obviously, the adventure, the 3-month expedition of being, crossing completely from one side to another of Alaska, pretty much. So it was very much geared around meeting the people and learning about who the people were, their traditions, and their connection to the river.
Amazing. And so was that with the same crew as your Cherokee Trail?
No. So on the Cherokee journey, that was with one person. That was with a guy called Jamie Barnes, another fellow sort of photographer and adventurer. The other one, the Yukon descent, was with a team of 3 people. So there was 4 of us in total. And we had 2 people from Montreal and 1 from Brooklyn. So we had a lady called Caroline Cote, who's an unbelievable athlete and adventurer and filmmaker. Equally incredible canoeist called Martin Trahan, who had crossed Canada by canoe. And then a photographer called Jay Kolsch, who is an incredible photographer from Brooklyn. And I put that team together without meeting any of them, and we met on the trip. So we'd had Skype calls, etc., etc. And we'd all talked about our kind of vision for the journey and the dream, but each person kind of had their designated role. So we filmed that trip, which is now a documentary on Amazon. And Martin was really the logistics guy of understanding how we would gather that amount of food for 3 months, the logistics of canoes, the logistics of sending food on, sending barrels on, etc., etc. The really sort of day-to-day mechanics of the journey. And then Jay was there to just capture that whole experience. So we obviously, none of us got paid for that trip. It featured in Sidetrack magazine of that year, but where we got a little bit of money for writing the story and Jay got some money for the pictures. But other than that, it was completely self-funded. So it was a pretty international team from Canada, US, UK, and it worked wonderfully. I mean, you have those challenges of human relationships, which you have on any trip with people that you haven't met and you haven't sort of formed and bonded over the years of friendship and relationships and understanding characteristics and drives and everything. But yeah, it became an epic journey that kickstarted everything for me.
Amazing. And what do you think? Because as I say, when you haven't met them and when you sort of are literally turning up probably to meet them for the first time, and on these trips you go through quite a few hardships and struggles which really push people to the test. What do you think sort of makes a successful expedition?
I think that what makes a successful expedition is personal narrative. Like the why is everything. So my narrative was to go and meet the people and paddle through some of the wildest sort of terrain in sort of, North America. Caroline's was to film it. She had an interest in native cultures as well. Martin was purely a canoeist. And Jay was the photographer, and Jay wanted to really capture that. So it was I think when we go on journeys or we choose journeys, the why is a massive important part of that. Because when times get tough, you get tired, you get hungry, like I had on the river, the story we've just discussed, it's the why is what keeps you moving forward. Yeah, you got to check in and be like, okay, this needs to change, or we need to adapt this, etc., etc. but the why is everything. And once you have a strong why, you will go beyond what needs to be done to sort of achieve that journey.
Yeah, we had George Kefford on last week, and he was saying that he writes down all his goals and his whys about why he's doing the trip. I mean, I always have it in my head, but by writing it down every time, he always said it comes to hardship, he'll look at his why and be like, this is why I want to be here. This is why I'm going through all these struggles, which I thought was a really great way of, you know, keeping a focus on the success of the expedition.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think as well, it's, you know, having accountability, having people there that are on that journey as well, that can lift you up when times of struggle, and then you do the same for them. But I think everybody having a personal connection to the journey is really, really, really important. And also everybody being clear about their motivations and their outcome for that journey. So what do people want to get out of it? You know, do you want A, B, C, D, or E, or do you want all of the above? You know, it's important that you clarify those kind of things if you go on a journey with people that you don't know, because sometimes wires can get crossed, and people think something that's not going to be sort of coming to fruition.
On some of these expeditions, I always find sometimes when you go with someone and you have different goals, were there any sort of clashes of goals where they sort of, conflicted in what one wanted to achieve and what the other one wanted, and they both couldn't work together?
Yeah, I think things can always work if you communicate. That trip, the Yukon trip in particular, was my dream trip, my first big ever 3-monther. And I kind of treated it like that. So it was like, oh, we can bring a filmmaker, fabulous. I'd love you to just capture an objective view of this trip. Photographer, I'd love you to capture an objective view of this trip. Martin, you can come along and help with. The thing is, I never set any really true boundaries. So it was like, yeah, we're going on this trip and we're doing this. We kind of know what we need to do. This is how we're going to do it. This is where the food's going to be, picking it up, you know, flying into here and flying out there. But I never set any boundaries with regards to decision making or safety and these kind of things. So especially on the Yukon, I was the least inexperienced, but I was one of the least inexperienced. So Martin was the most experienced person on that trip in terms of canoeing and long distance or expedition canoeing. So I looked up to him a lot, and I trusted him, and we looked to him for logistical sort of knowledge and how to get things done. And he was incredible at that. But we did clash because there was certain points within the trip where decisions were being made based on the skill set and the ability of him and the other canoeist, whereas myself and Caroline, who were in a canoe, our sort of collective skill set wasn't as strong. So I'm a great believer in, you know, you always work to the level of the weakest person, or those with the least, you know, skill set. You know, you're there for that person, and you help them through that situation if you've got better skills. And decisions were being made, and risks were being taken based on the stronger skill set. And when we had conversations about that, I then had to get to a point where I had to set boundaries and say, right, this is, I'm going to make the decisions here. Can we communicate before any decisions are made in the future? And this is why we're making those decisions. So, and that caused a little bit of friction, because you've got, on the one hand, you've got someone who's experienced and making decisions based on their experience, and then you've got me who's put the trip together and is erring on the side of safety. So you've got to find that sort of flux point of where you're working together, and then there's some movement within that, and that did cause some friction. But all you've got to do is just communicate and be open and be honest and say and explain why you're coming to this decision and why you're making this decision. I mean, then things tend to work okay. But yeah, I've always said on expeditions, the distance or the tiredness or the practical stuff is never the hardest. It's the human relationships which are the hardest. And and getting on with people when times are bad, cold, wet, hungry. That's when you find out what people are really made of, and how people respond to adversity. That's when you find what people are really made of. So yeah, that was the hardest part of the expedition for me, was the human relationships.
I think they all are. I think when you go on these trips, the human interactions and what people want are always the toughest. And if you can get that right, it usually makes for such a successful expedition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally agree. And that starts before you leave.
Yep.
So the people that you're with, talking to them, maybe even going out on a mini expedition with them, COVID permitting or whatever beforehand, is really important. And spending a few days with that person. So, if you're doing at some point you're doing a paddle, I'd imagine that you want to go and meet that person, paddle with them for a few days, or go hiking and wild camping with that person, or spending some time in nature with that person, so you can get to know them a little bit. So then when you you drop straight into that journey, you've got that foundation of understanding a little bit about each other, rather than doing what I did, which was just going straight off the deep end and making it work. But saying that, I learned on that trip. I learned some of the best leadership skills I've ever learned, probably even more than the Marines, by being on that journey and learning how to communicate with people in terms of their value systems and stuff like that, and learning how to communicate in terms of putting a team together to get the job done and finish and that kind of stuff, and with everybody in a safe way. So yeah, my only bit of advice on that would be get to know the person a little bit before you spend a lot of time with them.
Yeah. Well, as I say, your photography and film that you've done on some of these trips, and those ones in particular, are absolutely breathtaking. Your photography, well, as I know from being with you and also from your Instagram and website, is stunning. And for anyone who's interested in these stories, his website, ianfinch.com, tells the whole story through words, through images, through film. So you can go and check it out. So Ian, there's a part of the show where we ask the same 5 questions to each guest each week, with the first being, what's the one item or gadget that you always bring on your expeditions?
Other than a camera, which is like an extension of my body and my soul. One gadget. No, it's the camera. It's the camera. Without that, it's an extension of my body, and it's something that I take everywhere with me, and I'm learning to use now a little bit more, not respectfully, but what's the word? Intermittently. I'm learning to, now when I do expeditions and I take photos, I'm learning to look more rather than take photos more. There's a time to take photos, a time to not take photos. So I can't go anywhere without my camera.
Yeah, I agree. I think one thing I learned from one of my expeditions was, especially going through all the images and all the photos and videos from it, is actually having an idea of what you want to shoot before you shoot. Otherwise, you're just shooting for the sake of shooting, being like, oh, that looks nice, click, that looks nice, click. And then you get back and you realize that they're okay, but they're not great. And actually, if you say, this is what I want to shoot, take the time, shoot it, then put the camera away, and then just immerse yourself into that experience, I think that it helps massively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, and I've spoken about this before, where sometimes the camera can become a middleman, like a pane of glass between you and the experience, and the desire. When you like photography as much as I do and visual storytelling, your first instinct is to take a photo rather than look with your eyes and absorb that memory, etc. So I've had to learn to put the camera down, or to think about story, like you just pretty much what you just said there, to think about story and like, is this picture relevant to the story? Yeah, it could be. And then if not, the camera doesn't need to be there, doesn't need to be out and taking you away from that moment.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, what's it? I think it was when the Pope first came to power. There's a sort of picture of everyone holding up their iPads. And you're just watching the screen of what's actually happening. Whereas if you take it away and actually just take a moment for where you are, I think that memory holds a bit. Otherwise, you're just basically watching a TV. You might as well be at home.
Yeah, and I think a good practice for that is a few years ago I did a project where I walked across the Lake District and I only had a throwaway camera as my camera. So I left my DSLR at home and I only had the 27 images on an old Kodak throwaway camera that you can buy for like £7 from Amazon. And that was to force me into a position where I only had 27 images to create the story for that trip. And also I had a very rudimentary camera that had no focus. I had to measure the distance that it was in focus at, like the kind of focal length, etc. So what that taught me was, okay, if I come to a scene or anything, does this picture need to be taken? If it doesn't, the camera can go away. If it does, then it's a really important, beautiful picture because the light's right and the context is right. I would take the picture. So yeah, that was a nice example, that kind of nice way of doing things, because obviously iPhones and DSLRs, you've got unlimited imagery storage on those cards. So it's nice to do that every now and again, force yourself to be creative. Yeah.
No, very true. What camera do you have for all people listening?
I have a Nikon Z7. So I work with Nikon, which in today's world, they're not the best cameras out there. You've now got the Canon R5 or the Sony A7R4s and that kind of thing, which are technically better cameras. But I just love the color profiles that come out of Nikons. I may change one day, but for the moment, it's the Nikon.
Yeah. What is your favorite adventure or travel book?
So I probably would say it was this one. The quote, because I know one of the questions you're asking about from a quote, but it's this one here called The North American Indian. And it's a book by a photographer called Edward Curtis. Now, Edward Curtis was a guy that spent 20 or 30 years in the early 1900s using a plate camera. So like on an old tripod with plate glass kind of exposure. And he traveled around every tribe in North America and recorded them in that state, in that point. So I think we're talking early 1900s. And it took him 30 years to do it. And over this time, he's taken the most unbelievable portraits, sepia portraits of these Native Americans with their regalia on. The book, it was just inspired me in so many ways because of the incredible Native American portraits. And it's a book my dad gave to me as well, which gives it sort of equal, more importance than anything. But it's just the guy's technical photography and how good he was at taking these photos with the equipment that he had at that moment in history, and the time that it took him to the breadth of his work over 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. Why are adventures important to you?
Adventure is important because I think immersing ourselves in nature as much as we can is important. I think it's something that we are losing contact with. Our connection to the outdoors, our spiritual connection, our physical connection to the outdoors is something that I believe that we are slightly losing touch of. Also, adventure is so important because you're in some way or another, you're pushing a boundary or pushing a comfort zone. And that to me is how we grow as people. And not forgetting that adventure is very relative. So you could be a mum with 2 children and put a tent in the garden, and that could be adventure for you. Or you could be like me and you, where we travel to wild places for something a little bit more extreme or longer or everything like that. So remembering adventure is still relative, and adventure is in our DNA. Exploration is in our DNA as people, as human beings, to explore, to go to different terrains, different environments. And I think we need to nurture that and feed that as much as we can. And I think being in nature, spending time in nature, and just pushing ourselves is just good for the soul. It's food for the soul.
Yeah, no, I agree. As you were basically saying, I think the quote is comfort and growth cannot coexist.
Yeah, that's it. And one of mine is, without challenge, there is no growth. So that's why on those adventures, you're not talking, when you go on adventure, it doesn't have to be a physical challenge. It could be a mental challenge, cultural challenge, like challenge ideas, challenge your perspectives, challenge what you think is acceptable, not acceptable. And also challenge yourself in terms of what you can achieve, what you can endure. I think adventure is important for everybody on every level.
Yeah, I agree. What is your favorite quote?
So my favorite quote is from that book of Edward Curtis, and the quote is, "To accomplish it, Curtis has exchanged ease, comfort, home life for the hardest kind of work, frequent and long continued separation from his family, the wearing toil of travel through different regions, and finally the heartbreaking struggle of winning over to his purpose primitive men to whom ambitious, time, and money mean nothing, but to who a dream or a cloud in the sky or a bird flying across the trail from the wrong direction means much." And that to me says that, that the simple things on expeditions or in adventure are the most important things, and you endure all of those struggles of being separated from your family, the money that it might cost, the sacrifices that you might make to go in search of a more simpler life. And when you're on expeditions, I truly believe that it's when you break it down into those really simple processes and acts of taking a less amount of equipment and simplifying your life to a certain degree, that's where the true beauty of expeditions is to live more simply and exist more simply.
Very nice. People listening are always keen to travel and go on these big grand adventures. What's the one thing you would recommend to people wanting to get started?
Something that we've had to do because of COVID is to start local, and enjoy your local environment and explore what's around you. I would say if people are starting out is to, just start local, find a beautiful woodland, find a trail through a beautiful woodland, keep your phone in your pocket, don't bring your phone out, and just listen, have a mindful 20 minutes where you're not talking, and listen to how much more that you can hear, the birds, the animals, the wind, engage all of the senses. And if you're looking for something a little bit more challenging and longer distance, or something that's going to push you in different ways, again, start with your why. What environment would I love this adventure to be in? Would it be woodlands? Would it be mountains? Would it be on a river? Would it be on water? And write down every component of that adventure. How long would it be for? Would I be with other people? What would be the goal of the journey? How long would it be for? Write all of those things down in like a mini mind map, and then think, okay, so what places can I go that are mountainous? What river could I go to that's here or there? Would I need to travel? Really break down and back engineer the components of that adventure, and just really free think. Write down anything, and don't let any restrictions, be they travel restrictions, physical restrictions, whether you feel you can do it or can't do it mentally, free think. Just write down exactly that dream adventure, that dream trip. And if it's something you can't do this year, do it next year. Find something that feeds into some of those points somewhere here in the UK. So you could go to Wales, Scotland, Lake District. There's rivers, there's mountains, there's woodlands, there's long distance, small distance trails. There's no excuse.
Yeah.
The excuse and the barriers are the ones that we put up ourselves. So just design your dream adventure and then find a way to make that happen. And if you can't, contact me. I'll help you make it happen.
Well, there you go. No, I think it's very true. I think, for this summer especially, as we were discussing before, the podcast started, my intention and probably yours is to keep it local, to keep it UK based. And I think, well, not that we have any choice anyway, but I think it's also nice to explore your own place, your own home. I remember in 2017 cycling up to Edinburgh, and I was just like blown away by the Peak District and the Lake District especially. And I had never really had any desire to go up there, but other than maybe from with Nell and I. But other than that, I had no intention, but it was, more breathtaking than nearly 99% of the places I've been around the world. And it's right on your doorstep, well, right on my doorstep. So yeah, it's definitely one to do. Think local.
Yeah, that's it. And I think a lot of the time we assume adventure is far away, going to another country, another continent, or going to a desert, mountain range, or whatever. But again, going back to that, adventure is a mindset. And what it means to you and what it means to me is probably similar, but slightly different. And what it means to a mum of two children is very different. So yeah, explore local and find out kind of what adventure really means to you. Because you can go and sleep in a bivvy bag in a beautiful pine woodland somewhere and take a little stove and make a cup of tea in the morning and that kind of thing, even, the boundaries of things being legal or non-legal, but you could do that. And that's an incredible adventure. Or it being in this country, you could go to a bothy, you could set up a bothy adventure and go and stay in bothies. Now, bothies are what make a hike into a very cool adventure. So there's if you get creative and, you find ways to do things, you can have an adventure in this country, a really good adventure.
Yeah. Finally, what are you doing now and how can people follow your trips in the future?
So what I'm doing now is planning for the year ahead, which is probably going to be UK or local Europe based. I'm thinking of potentially with a friend, if we can, crossing Sweden by foot and then Norway by canoe. So Norway and Sweden are joined together. So we're going to just literally go across the width of those two countries. If we can't do that, more than likely it will be Scotland or something along those lines. Some big adventures, canoeing, some big locks, maybe something similar like that. Something that's arduous, quite challenging for a week or two. And you can find me on Instagram. So it's at Ian, the letter E, Finch. And my website, which is www.ianefinch.com.
Amazing. Well, Ian, thank you so much for coming on the show today. You have some incredible stories to tell, and I'm sure a few more that we haven't had the chance to get through. And for people listening, as I was saying on the podcast, Ian's photography is truly brilliant. So do check out his website, and you can see, and Instagram. And you can see all the amazing photography he's done over the years.
Lovely. Thank you.
Well, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you got something out of it. If you did, hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you in the next video.